I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 92. Today in the show, we're joined by map-making expert Ben Harshyne to discuss how maps can make you a better deer hunter. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today we are talking about one of the very most important tools a hunter will ever use, and a skill set that will without a doubt make you a better deer hunter. And we're talking about maps, and aerial photos, and topography lines, and cover, and terrain, and funnels, and so much more. I just think this is going to be an awesome episode. So we're going to be discussing the many different things you can see and learn about on maps and how those various features actually look on the ground, and then finally how deer use them. So, you've probably heard me and Dan talk about how often we stare at maps, and that's for a good reason. It's not just because we're lazy and don't want to do real work. It's because you can learn so much from maps, and because they can help you implement a really sound deer hunting strategy. So that's the plan for today. We're going to cover all of these topics I just mentioned and much more in as much detail as we possibly can. And joining us is Ben Harshyne, a map-making guru with a serious pedigree in cartography and a hardcore whitetail addict who recently moved to the great state of Iowa. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that my trusty co-host Dan Johnson could not join us today, unfortunately. So he's not going to be able to share with you his latest shed hunting exploits as we'd planned. But I can tell you that both I and Dan put the shed hunting advice that we covered in the last episode to good use, as we actually both found a good haul of sheds this past weekend, and I actually found my two largest Michigan sheds yet, so that was pretty awesome. So nonetheless, next week Dan should be back, and I'm guessing we're both going to have some good stories because I'm heading to Iowa this weekend, and I'm going to have 3 full days of shed hunting, and hopefully he's going to be able to escape some of his adult responsibilities to join me for a little bit of that, and if things go well, we'll hopefully have some good shed hunting stories to share, so stay tuned for all that. But with all that said, since there's no co-host for me to BS with today, we're going to get right into our interview with Ben. But briefly before that, we're going to take a quick second to thank our sponsors of this podcast, Sitka Gear. And this week, as you might have guessed, we've got Sitka product category leader Dennis Zuck with us. And I wanted to ask Dennis about a program that launched last year for which Sitka created a group called the Sitka Whitetail Ambassador Team, which I'm actually a part of, as well as our guest today, Ben Harshyne. So, Dennis, what's the deal with this Sitka Whitetail Ambassador Team?
Yeah, and it's something we're really excited about, because we think about who we're building for and the guys out there that we're trying to create great products for. A lot of them, they are those ambassador types of guys. These are people who are driven. They hunt hard. They care a lot about their gear, their bow, everything they own. They really analyze all the details. And for us, we want to make sure we're working with those guys to create great gear and coming up with those next great ideas, and we're helping them understand, why does Sitka make products the way they do, and they become that voice. These guys are guys who are going to be able to relay that message, to their buddies, to the other guys that they live around the hunt with, and help them understand, how does some of the things we talked about in these podcasts, so why wicking layers, why insulation, these guys are going to carry that message for us, and we're super excited to have them, and they're going to carry an authentic message back to us around, what's missing, what else.
So for someone who feels like they fit that profile, is there any way for people to proactively possibly become a part of that process or that type of group?
Yeah, so absolutely. Our Sitka webpage and a lot of our social media formats, believe it or not, we pay a lot of attention, and we're watching the people who are posting and who are active, who are asking questions, very interested. We seek those folks out. People don't know that we reach out to those folks, but we do. And the ambassadors are groups of people who will come from that. So if that's something you're interested in, be active, be involved, give your input. We do notice, we pay attention.
So there you have it. And in addition to what Dennis said, if you're interested in seeing what some of the current Sitka Whitetail ambassadors are up to, you can check out on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook the hashtag SitkaSWAT. That's Sitka, SITKA, SWAT, SWAT. That stands for Sitka Whitetail Ambassador Team. So check out hashtag SitkaSWAT for some of the photos and videos that all these guys and gals are posting. There's some great stuff out there. And if you'd just like to learn more about Sitka gear, you can visit sitkagear.com. So with all that out of the way, it is now time to get Mr. Ben Harshyne on the line. All right, with us now on the show is Ben Harshyne. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to chat with you. We've been able to talk on the phone a handful of times over the past year or two, and I always get these little snippets of your map, just genius. I hear some things that your background always intrigues me, and I've wanted to totally pick your brain and geek out on maps because, if Dan was here, I know he'd be feeling the same way. Me and him are just map nuts. We are obsessed with them. We're always looking at them. We're always thinking about them. We're dreaming about them and going through all the various little planning or scouting elements that are tied into maps. So it's something we love, and it's nice to be on the line with someone who I think shares that same love. So thank you, Ben. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
And that all said, just before we got on the phone with you, I did a brief introduction for our audience, and I basically explained two basic things: that you're a map guru and that you're a whitetail nut. So with that little bit already out of the way, could you just elaborate a little bit for us on, where your map background came from? What's your education? What do you do now? And how has all of that merged in with your love of deer hunting?
Yeah, sure thing. So first off, born and raised in western Pennsylvania, and went to school at Penn State actually I have a degree in geography, but my emphasis in all of my studies were towards geographic information systems. A lot of people know it as GIS, but really what I focused on was cartography. So the actual the study of the production and the design of maps is really what I pursued in college, and it took me down to Washington D.C. area, where I worked as a contractor making maps for the military and the National Counterterrorism Center. Had a pretty unique experience in doing that, and spent 7 years there making maps for finished intelligence products that were essentially briefed to decision makers on events that were happening around the world. So it was a phenomenal experience for sure. And around 2010, actually I made a map of so being in western Pennsylvania, I was basically raised on a hunting ground that was all forest. So if you look at the image from an online map source, and it would just basically look like nothing but a sea of green. So I made a map for my dad for Father's Day that basically depicted the terrain inside of on that property. So, standard imagery is just going to show you nothing but green, and you really can't differentiate what's going on the property. I figured out a way to actually visualize the terrain there, and that was kind of a game changer for us. It was, at the time, a pretty cool gift for him, and we used it to, further enhance our scouting efforts and our hunting success. And, terrain plays a big picture in what you look for as a deer hunter, which I'm sure we'll get into. But anyways, I made that map, and he showed it to his buddies, and they were pretty excited about it. They ordered maps from me, and word just kind of organically spread. And I decided to create a business. I call it Huntera Mapping, and it was awesome. I continued to work as a contractor, and in my spare time, made these maps, make some pocket change for hunting season, and it just continued to build and grow. And I really focused on bringing something different to the table for map production, specifically for hunters, because it was my passion, and that's what I enjoyed doing in my free time. So fast forward to be like the fall of 2014, and my wife and I realized that it was kind of decision time as far as what we're going to do with it. It was consuming all of our time, all of our spare time, and we decided to, let's go after this thing, and we packed up and uprooted everything from Northern Virginia, moved to the Midwest to give it Huntera everything we had, and to really get into the thick of where we do a lot of marketing. We've got a lot of partners out here and clients. We make maps for all over the country, but aside from that, I'm a whitetail hunting fanatic, and there's really arguably no better place to be than in Iowa. So we landed in eastern Iowa and set up shop, and that's where we are today.
That's awesome, Ben. And I just really love your story because I feel like I can relate to it a lot. Being a one-man show myself, at least starting, I know that you started from the ground up with you and your wife, and I've kind of followed in a similar path, and I know that's a challenge, and it's pretty cool, though, to be able to merge that background and skill set you have with map making and all that goes into that with your love for whitetails. So I love that story, but here's the real question, Ben. You made the move to Iowa that, I sit and dream about every day. So I think your first full hunting season in Iowa was this past fall. Was it everything you dreamed it would be?
Yeah, it was pretty phenomenal. I got access to, so it was the first, I've never got enough points to come hunt Iowa before we've actually moved here. And I've hunted the Midwest. I've been hunting the Midwest a good bit here over the past decade. But never in this state. So when we landed here, I got to the point where I was a resident long enough where I could buy a tag. And I got access to a nice property for archery season this past year. And it was funny. It's essentially a combination of a cattle farm and CRP ground. And there's a lot of fencing on the property, but regardless, I had a couple of small food plots that I put in, and right off the bat, we had a good wind October 2nd to hunt a stand in the middle of the property, and right off the food plot. And my parents were in town. We're actually doing some work on the basement of the house that we bought. And I said to my dad, "Man, this would be awesome timing to go sit Iowa for my first time with you. With the man who fueled introduced me to hunting and fueled the passion that I have today." So it was like perfect timing. Went down there and didn't expect to see, a big deer necessarily right off the bat. My cameras were pretty not showing too much, but sure enough, ended up encountering a really good deer. I'm guessing 5.5 years old or older. That first evening, and he was just annihilating a tree, and he came out to the food plot. I was thinking, I really want to, get a good sit in here in Iowa this first year and get a whole season in there. But if he comes by, I'm going to have to shoot him. And he didn't come by, but I ended up encountering that deer 8 different times from October 2nd to December 4th, and I never could catch up to him. So No, it was awesome though, and it was a lot of high quality, high value sits here. So it was a lot of fun and special place to be.
That is awesome. That's pretty cool to have one of those first hunts to have such an experience like that. That doesn't happen very often, but it happened to me once. My first time ever hunting my southern Ohio property that I hunt now a lot. The very first time I ever hunted it, I saw this huge 4-year-old buck, 4 or 5-year-old buck that I came to call Jawbreaker, and I've talked about a lot on the podcast and stuff. So that was kind of cool. So I hope you can continue that story and that hunt next year. Do you know if he made it to the new year?
Yeah, pretty sure he did make it, and looking forward to hopefully pursuing him again. And in my eyes, at this point in my career of hunting, and I think I spoke to you about this before, but it's really, for me, the ultimate trophy is creating history with one specific animal and building that quest to try to figure him out, and that chess match between you two is really, that's the ultimate trophy. And then eventually catching up to him would be icing on the cake. So, I've got a good opportunity to do that, and I think he did survive. So we'll see what happens.
That's exciting. I 100% agree with you. That is my favorite thing about, as I've kind of moved in my journey as a deer hunter, that my absolute favorite thing now has been this opportunity to get to know a deer over multiple years and have all those ups and downs and encounters and challenges, and maybe once it all comes together. So, man, that's cool. Is he, you said he was a 5-year-old? What kind of, is he really wide? Is he really tall? What's his rack story?
Yeah. So, the reason it kind of gets, and there's a lot of opinions about aging deer on the hoof and whatnot. But, he just had this giant body, deep sagging belly, kind of a swooping low back, almost like a saddle, which is what we're going to talk about. Just had this look of a deer that was fully mature. So not that's why I was guessing 5.5. But as far as his rack, probably a low 60s deer, just a really high,
wow.
Decently heavy, perfectly clean 10. So, he's awesome. I actually named him Pork. My dad's nickname is Pork, and all my buddies know my dad is Pork. And it's funny because I was with my dad when I saw this deer, and he came out and was like, "Oh my gosh, he is just huge body." And so he got dubbed the nickname Pork. And it's funny. I'm actually looking at the map right now from my farthest. If you should take my 4 stands farthest from each other, kind of like the outer edges of where I chase this deer, you're only looking at probably 100 acres of really good cover and a couple varieties of food sources. So the farm is larger than that, but I really, between encounters and camera sightings, dialed into him, or I saw him a bunch. He just was always one step ahead of me. So it's interesting to kind of, as cliche as it sounds, look at the map and really see where, what the story is telling you. So.
Yeah. So do you fall prey to the same thing that me and Dan do? Do you ever find yourself not working because you're just staring at a map and thinking about that stuff?
Yeah, so for sure. In my office here, I've got a big map of that property, and actually, so I'm looking at that. All year I was looking at that thing, trying to figure out how I'm going to intercept Pork. But I've also got maps of properties that I probably won't ever hunt again, that I've had some really memorable hunts on, and these maps here are just, as a hunter, they're a tool, but they're also like the perfect way to look at, and bring up and drum up memories again. So I'm fanatical about maps. I'm fanatical about hunting, but the fact is these maps can be trophies in their own right too. So they're definitely like the ultimate distraction, in a whitetail hunter's office.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. And to your point, they're kind of, especially, really nice maps like yours, it's almost like art itself. Just you can stare at that, and it's memories, it's a story, it's a tool too, but in and of itself, it kind of takes you into that world and can kind of transport you to that other place, whether it be looking on your computer at a map or a real map on the wall, a great looking map or whatever it is. Maps kind of have a way of taking us to that other place that's kind of special in a kind of floaty weird way, I guess, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure.
I kind of geek out about it. So without getting too far down that path, I suppose, given all of your background with maps, right? You've got a very unique skill set compared to a lot of people we talk to. Myself and Dan and a lot of our guests, like, we're serious deer hunters, so we use maps, but no one I've talked to has this experience as to how maps are made, or what are the specifics of a map, what are the details on a map that maybe I'm not noticing or thinking about. So kind of before we dive into all the different ways that hunters can use maps, and there's a lot of them, and I want to talk about what to look for on maps and what those things look like in real life, how do hunters use them, how do deer use them. There's a lot of that kind of stuff I want to cover, but before we get to all that, I think it might be helpful to just cover some of the basics, for those of us maybe that are relatively familiar, or those that maybe aren't familiar at all with how to use all these different kinds of maps. But could you maybe start us out with, helping us understand some of the terminology? Are there any basic terms that we need to understand related to maps before we can dive into all the other details?
Yeah, for sure. So we'll start right at the top. Sometimes the word cartography, comes up, and some people are like, what is that? So cartography, as I mentioned before, is the practice of designing maps. And with maps, you always got layers of information. There's a lot of different types of maps and charts out there. They've got goals of displaying, for navigation purposes, displaying quantitative and qualitative differences in data, but it's all basically showing geography and location and the story on top of that. So without telling you the history of mapping here, really what we want to focus on are a couple different layers of information and how they relate to the geography of where you're hunting. Specifically the two layers, and that's really where Huntera, and this isn't going to be a big pitch about my company or anything like that, but an important piece of the puzzle here are two factors. You've got topography, which sometimes that gets twisted around in really what that is, but you've got topography, which are essentially the features that comprise elevation changes throughout the property. So anywhere that you have elevation rise or fall, whether it's drastic or gradual, those features like hills, ridges, saddles, valleys, those features are pertaining to topography. Now, in addition to the topography, we talk about land cover, which is the other layer to this picture. And land cover is really what you see from pick your online viewer, whether it's Google or Bing or whatever. It's going to be the picture of the earth, and the land cover is the timber versus open ground versus water versus man-made features. So really the picture that you see is typically the land cover, and there's things that we look for there as deer hunters. Then there's topography, which are your terrain features and your elevation changes, which is there's features there that we look for as well. So those are really the two main things that we look for, and what we design as map makers. We're blending those two to be able to give you the full picture of how an animal is going to move from A to B to C, and how you're going to intercept them on the property.
So you mentioned two different types of maps, or layers of maps, and right, you've got an aerial map, which you mentioned, maybe it's a Google map or whatever it might be that shows a picture, like cover, like a satellite view almost. Then you have a topo map, or a topo layer, which shows that elevation changes you mentioned. I want to kind of dive into a little more detail on both of those, and then I know that you're able to do something a little bit different comparing both of those. If you're okay with it, I'd like to start on the two individuals, and with an aerial and then with a topo map individually. Can you share with us, what is that best used for, and then what do you miss with that? And then, maybe you can share a little bit with how the maps you're making maybe account for some of those challenges.
Yeah, sure. So we'll start with the aerial, and really that dates back to the, oh man, I've actually, I think there's imagery back into the 40s maybe. Regardless, essentially the aerial is a picture from the sky shooting down onto the land, and from there you can distinguish where your fields are. So you can distinguish agricultural fields, which is, potential food sources, to CRP fields where there could be cover, pasture ground, meadows. That's really your open ground. You can see the timber. Sometimes, depending on whenever that aerial was taken, you can differentiate between whether that timber has hardwoods in it, or if it's comprised of conifers, or both. Since conifers will hold their needles all year, you can distinguish that in a wintertime aerial shot. Sometimes you can differentiate whether an area is thicker than other places. So that's regarding timber. You can see your water features at times, your streams, ponds, lakes, your swamps, and then of course whatever man-made features are in that aerial as well. Farmsteads and roads, even fence lines. So that's what an aerial is going to give you, and where typically, unless you're in really rugged terrain, where what that is not going to show you is the elevation changes. So there might be a nice ridge line going along, cutting through the middle of that timber that you can't see, or there might be fingers of timber that are jutting out into agricultural ground, and you can't necessarily tell that there are ditches in the middle of that timber, which could really kind of funnel where deer are going to move and where you want to potentially set up a stand site. So that's where your trade-off is going to be with your aerial photo, but it's going to give you a really good idea of what is on the ground there. Now I'll transition to your traditional topo map, originally made by the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS topo maps. A lot of people are familiar for, and they're essentially those maps that have lines, contour lines that cut around the elevation, that represent elevation at certain heights, and those lines, whenever you look at it holistically, can tell you where your gradual elevation changes are, where your steep elevation changes are, and you can actually distinguish. You can look at a topo map and literally distinguish the major and minor terrain features of the land. So it's interesting. I learned back in school, if you in the reader, or not the readers, but the audience can do this. If you make a fist like you're going to punch yourself in the face, believe it or not, and you look at that fist, okay, at the entire line of your knuckles, that's going to be your ridge line. So this is basically a diagram I'm laying out for the terrain features that we'll be talking about. So it'll sometimes help people visualize what exactly we're looking for. So your knuckles, those are your ridge lines. And then, all of the knuckles on your hand is your ridge line. And then the individual knuckles, those are hills. So those are going to be the highest points of ground. In between your knuckles are going to be your saddles. So the lower points in between your hills and along a ridge are your saddles. We talk a lot about spurs, which are sometimes considered secondary ridges. Looking at a topo map there, you've got your main ridge, and you've got these other ridges that seem to be coming off of it. Those traditionally are called spurs. And if you're looking at the fist, those are basically your fingers coming off of the ridge line. And then in between those spurs are draws, which are basically, sometimes they're considered ditches as well. They're basically small valleys that come off of your saddles that from water eroding, and those are your draws. So those are some of the terrain features that come up in the terminology we use as deer hunters. And I know that's a lot to digest initially, but it's pretty interesting. You can actually see the diagram online where that hand demonstrates all of these different terrain features that are important to us.
I love that. That's a great way to visualize this stuff, because I think a lot of these, you hear these terms, and if you're not already very familiar with it, it can be kind of difficult to visualize. So that's a really easy way to do it, and I've never heard someone explain it that way.
Yeah, so it's. I know Dan would be, if he was here, he'd be getting a kick out of it. Mention it like this, make this, act like you're going to punch yourself in the face. But yeah, it is. It's sometimes that terminology gets, I don't want to say misused, but it's good to kind of call these things what they really are, so that as we're talking as deer hunters, we can actually be consistent with, whenever we're sharing our information. But yeah, those terrain features that all kind of come from that hand, that is really what is going to tell us the story of how deer are moving, just wildlife in general, moving around the property. So.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned all those, because those were some of the things that I definitely wanted to make sure we dove into in detail. But before we get to that, one other aspect, you mentioned a lot of these different features that you can see on a topographic map. But one of the challenges, I think, if someone picks up a topo map for the first time, is they look at this and it's just all these squiggly lines. And it's hard to make sense of if you don't have sort of an education in how to use topo maps. Can you share us just a simple explanation of how to look at a topo map? I understand the analogy you use with the fist, but when I look at the lines and all that, is there any way to explain that verbally?
Yeah. So the simplest one that's going to jump out to you, if you don't have much experience with a standard topo map, is look for areas that have the lines close together. So a line is essentially a consistent elevation. And then you've got your next line, which is that next elevation, whether it's a 10-foot difference or a 50-foot difference between lines, and each map is going to tell you what that difference in interval is. But whenever you have contour lines that are tight together, that represents a drastic elevation change in a short amount of time. So a cliff, take a cliff, for example. Everybody knows what a cliff is, and that's actually considered officially a minor terrain feature. But a cliff is going to have many lines right on top of each other, if not right next to each other, symbolizing that the land is coming across and then basically dropping straight down. Now, on the other hand, if you try to find, if you see areas where lines are farther apart from each other, that's going to be a gradual, flatter area. So longer distances in between elevation change means more gradual slope. So those are the two main things you can get right off the bat off of a topo map. And then there's other things, fancier things you can look for, and it's kind of hard to describe just without visualizing it, with a graphic or something. But saddles, well, first we'll start with hills. Hills are going to be basically the circles. As you see these contour lines work its way up the slope, and the very, very top one essentially is a circle that represents the highest elevation point on that area. So that's going to be your hill. Well, if you have two hills side by side with a lower area in between, and I think basically that'll kind of look like an hourglass, like the skinny part of an hourglass, that's going to be your saddle. So these are features that you can basically pick out with the topo map. They're going to, if you start to study how these contour lines move and relate to each other, it's going to tell you a lot about the ruggedness or the lack thereof on your property. So another one that we look for are valleys. So if you can get a grasp on, okay, here's my highest point, here's my hill, and here's where it's sloping down, and then it basically comes to the bottom, and then you can tell it starts to work its way back up. Well, that crease in the middle is going to be your valley. sometimes, a lot of times it's a stream bed. So water naturally flows down because of gravity. And a lot of times you're going to find your water on that property in that valley. So that's something that can really, help you get a grasp once you really start to understand, okay, here's an area that has a higher elevation. Here's my slope. It's going downhill. Boom, there's a valley. And then you can look in there. And if the topo map is really getting if it's really able to be detailed enough, you'll be able to pick out things like benches. So a bench, and this is really our bread and butter back in Pennsylvania with my dad and I and some of our stand locations. A bench is essentially, you've got a pretty steep hill coming off of a ridge, and you've got basically those lines come farther apart. So they're pretty close together, then they're wider for a little while. That represents a flat area on the side of the hill, and then maybe it will start to drop down again. So the topo map can be kind of tricky to work with if you don't have familiarity with it on a consistent basis. But that's really, whenever we added that feature on top of some of the other relief shading and everything we do with Huntera, it really was a game changer for what we were doing, because not only did you have the aerial photo, you have topo map, and it's telling you land cover funnels and pinch points and features, and it's telling you terrain funnels and pinch points and features.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And one of the things with topo maps, I don't know if this is something other people do, but when I first started looking at topo maps, it was just like, I felt like I was looking at a maze or something that I just did not process it all in my head. But then, I started doing the things like you mentioned. I started looking for the hills. Okay, if that's a hill, then okay, that must be a valley, and that must be a ridge. And as you start to intellectually understand that, it almost feels like. Did you ever look at those books back when you were in school, these 3D books? You stare at an image, and if you stare at it long enough in a certain way, all of a sudden this 3D image comes out. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Optical illusions or something, almost like that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost like that with a topo map now for me, where once I figure out, okay, these are the high points, these are the low points, and I look at it in a certain way, it almost becomes three-dimensional in a way, and you can see it. But that takes a while to see it that way, which is why I really like what you're doing with your maps, because you're adding the actual relief and shading so that it stands out and it actually looks like it's higher or lower. And so, even if somebody wasn't going to buy a new map or anything, it would be helpful for people just to almost look at, for example, I've got maps that you had created, Ben, for me of some of my hunting properties that I've included on blog posts and things for Wired to Hunt, where it shows this aerial image of a farm with the topography, with the terrain, elevation, the shading and stuff, as you mentioned, shown, plus the topo map. So you can see the topo lines overlaid over the actual relief imaging, which can almost help you align in your head, okay, those lines like that look like that. And so you can then, if you were to separate it, then it makes a little bit more sense. It's almost like a training mechanism. If you don't have any experience at all, it's helpful to look at a picture to then say, okay, that's what the picture looks like. This is what it looks like in topo lines. It's a great tool, and obviously having it all layered in one map is the ultimate, which is why I love using those maps. But there's a lot. It takes some experience. It takes looking at these things and kind of just getting your brain and your eye used to how to read it before you can then start layering over how do deer use these things. So it's definitely a process.
Yeah, for sure.
So okay, let's say hypothetically, right, we understand how to look at these maps and read them, whether it's an aerial or a topo or all three combined. Now that we have these maps and understanding, how are you actually using them as a hunter? I mean, for me, I use maps in a couple different ways. I'm looking at them when I'm scouting a property, even before I go on the ground. I'm looking at it when I'm actually hunting, when I'm setting things up or thinking about how deer might use it or how I might, enter and exit, all these different things. And then even, from how I'm managing a property. But I'm curious from your perspective, are you using maps in any of those ways or in any, in any other ways? Could you elaborate on how you use maps in your tool set?
Yeah, for sure. And you've nailed them. Whether you're considering trying to access a piece of property you've never been on before, whether you're maybe looking for permission ground, or even you're looking to purchase that property. We work with a lot of clients that are in land transactions. So before you even touch that property, the map is going to be your number one tool. Just like you were going to, you need a blueprint to build a house. You need a map to be able to pinpoint where you're going to start scouting your property. It's going to save you a lot of time ahead of, if you know what to look for, it's going to save you a lot of time to know exactly where you want to pinpoint some of your initial scouting efforts. So before you even touch that property is vital. And then during the season, once you've been on that property, you go there and you ground truth some of the features that you look for. So right off the bat, I look for, number one question here is, where do I think deer are going to be bedding? Okay, we're going to look for bedding areas. We're going to look for potential food sources, whether there's food plots on the property or not. You're going to look for your bedding areas. You're going to look for your cover areas. You're going to look for your food areas and your travel routes in between there. And you go on the ground and you actually try to ground truth and figure out if, what you were looking for is there. Look for the deer sign to try to confirm what you initially thought with the property. So as soon as you hit it, the map is important. And then throughout hunting season, say you've been on a property for 5 years, and you think you know it like the back of your hand, which you probably do. It's always good just to continue to look at that map and really put together the pieces of the puzzle, from encounters to cameras, pictures you got of specific deer with a trail camera. You look at how you're accessing the property, things you could change about it. It's always basically, I'm always keeping my map updated and looking at the current snapshot of what's going on with it. So that's really, even in season and in post season, the map is always playing an important role. There's kind of two different ways you can look at the map and look at your property. There's macro and then there's micro. So macro is how is your land, and you got to zoom out on this. How is the property that you're hunting or thinking about hunting or thinking about buying, how does that property play into the surrounding area? Are you competing with a lot of food sources? Do you have the best cover in town? Is your ground a major travel corridor in between bigger chunks of timber? You try to see how your property plays into the holistic, reasonable area of a deer herd, which is not, unless you have thousands of acres, mature bucks are known to roam a square mile or even more, depending on where you're at and what your cover and food is like. So you got to look at the property from a macro level and see how the edges of your property are able to exploit deer travel on and off of it. And then you look at the micro aspect of studying a map, and that's really looking for the specific features that we're talking about. Once we're on a piece of property, we're looking for specific features at that micro level that we can exploit to catch up to a deer. Whether it's through, we're looking at ways we're accessing stand locations, or laying out sanctuaries that we're not going to touch except for maybe during shed season to give deer a form of security year round. We're looking at potential places to put in food plots, or where we can enhance cover more. We're looking for creek crossings, that micro level once we're actually on a property. So you're never going to get the whole story with a map. You got to get on the ground and look for sign and confirm really what's going on there. And you got to hunt the property. The map is not just going to hunt for you, but it's going to give you a really good step in getting there quicker, and then it's going to be at your side to really tell you and guide you through and have a conversation with you, as crazy as that sounds, on what you should be doing to make adjustments and have some success in the field.
Yeah, you hit it on the head. I think there's a couple things in there that I want to comment on. Number one, I love the fact that you brought up the point of the macro level and understanding how your property fits into the larger scheme of things. I mean, I think so often we get tunnel vision, right? We look at just our property, just within our property lines, and inform all of our hunting decisions or habitat improvement decisions all based on that. And that's a huge mistake a lot of the time, because to your point, there's so many other things. A deer's life encompasses a lot more than just a single property in most cases. You need to know how all these things factor in it. So when you're looking to buy a property even, or lease a property, or trying to get permission on hunting properties, understanding how your piece fits into the larger puzzle can be a make or break decision. I mean, for example, my Southern Ohio lease is a very small piece. It's 90 acres, of which only like 40 acres are even huntable. The rest is just field. So it's a pretty darn small piece of actual huntable ground. But because of how it fits into the larger landscape, it pulls deer in from a much wider area and funnels them into this section. So it makes it a much more huntable, a much better property than it might look if you were to just look within the border. So super, super important to look at the big picture. And then, like you said, it can guide you throughout the season then too, from a decision standpoint, and even before the hunting season. I want to make a point when it comes to scouting. There's nothing more important from a scouting aspect, for me at least, than those initial hours or days scouting via map. It makes real on-the-ground scouting so much more effective and efficient, really. I mean, especially when I'm hunting these out-of-state locations that some other guys do too, where I'm traveling to Iowa or Ohio, and I only have a weekend or a day or something to scout a new property. I can't walk every square inch of it, right? Most of us don't have the time to walk every square inch of a property that we maybe already have permission to hunt or might have permission to hunt or whatever it is. But if you can look at a map and identify some of those key things you mentioned, Ben, like, all right, I think there's probably bedding here. I think there's probably a good food source here. And then spend your 5 hours just double checking those places, man, you can be a lot more effective with your time. So
yeah, you can definitely get ahead of the game.
Yeah. And one other example that came to mind when you were talking about almost having a conversation with a map, and I like that analogy, because it's, maybe I'm weird, but it's true in my case. Like, I can look at a map throughout a season over and over. I mean, I literally look at maps before every single hunt, and sometimes after every single hunt. Like, every single day I'm looking at these maps, and I'm thinking through how I'm going to move on the property and how I think deer are going to move on the property, and then how the wind is moving on the property. And so that's an everyday thing for me throughout the season. And if I didn't have a good map to look at, I'd be blind. So an example of this, which is interesting, and it almost paid off in the hugest way. And our listeners know I hunted a couple new properties in Iowa last year. So I got permission on them, and I had like an hour or two to walk both of these properties, and they were like 400 to 700 acre properties. So I had very little time to walk them. I just kind of checked some key places. But even with that small amount of scouting, there's still a lot I didn't know. So before my first trip to hunt, my buddy and I sat at a little diner one Thursday morning, and I had my map with me, and we sat down and drank coffee for like 2.5 hours with this map in between us, and we just looked at it and talked about it. I think there might be something happening here. And what do you think about how the deer might be using that ridgeline? And this kind of looks like this might be a good way to access based on what I saw here. And here's a creek bottom. I think I can snake up there. So for 2 hours, we just sat there and walked through how we thought deer were using this and how I might want to hunt it. And so when I initially came into that morning, I was thinking, okay, my first hunt, I want to be relatively low risk, right? I don't really know what's going on, so I want to learn from my first hunt without screwing things up too much. But at the same time, there was a cold front coming and conditions were great, so I wanted to, be in a position where I might be able to catch some action. So there was this point of a crop field extending into this larger section of timber that I thought might be worth hunting. So, before pre-coffee and maps, that's where I was going to go. So for 2 hours, we sat talking about, okay, yeah, that looks good. And we were talking about the wind direction, what it was supposed to be and all that. And somehow, for the first 2 hours or whatever it was, that we were sitting there. Actually, it was the whole conversation. We were thinking that's a good idea. And it wasn't until I went home later that day, I looked at the map again. And it's funny how, I don't know, it's probably more of a me thing than a map thing, but all of a sudden something clicked in my head with that map that I was thinking about all the wrong way. And I started thinking, with that wind, I actually think the deer would be traveling a different direction to take advantage of that. And also, with the wind how it was, looking at that map, and I actually will almost like pencil in or marker in sometimes, where I think, or crayon in where I think that wind's going to be blowing, just so I can visualize. I'm a visual guy when it comes to these things. So after doing all this thinking, I finally had this aha moment that said, no, you are going about the completely wrong way. You need to go to this other point where it wasn't a point, but an extension of the timber out into the field. So it was the opposite section where I could access it a lot easier, but I found this little hidden water hole that I hadn't seen before until after staring at that map for 2.5 hours. And lo and behold, I snuck in there, hung a stand the first night, and I had the biggest 8-pointer 4 or 5-year-old buck I've ever seen in my life within 20 yards of my stand. Now, sure, there's a little bit of luck in that, but if I hadn't spent 2.5 hours thinking and visualizing and looking at this map, I would have never sat there. Who knows what would happen? So that's a very long-winded example, but there's so much power to looking at these things.
Listen, it's a lot of guys are either hunting public ground, which they're dealing with huge potential areas to hunt, thousands of acres, or maybe they're going out of state on a do-it-yourself hunt somewhere. You've got to maximize and make your time in the field as beneficial as possible. And just aimlessly walking around on the property is not going to get you too far. So yeah, I mean, that's great. And I had the same thing. I got so focused on chasing this one deer this year that I neglected some other parts of the property. And it hit me one day. I'm looking at this map. I'm like, man, I was getting some great pictures on this part of the farm of some consistent pictures of this one deer. And then I was getting them on the other part of the farm, and it just kind of hit me. And this one hillside that I've never even attempted to check out because it was a little more, I didn't want to put a camera back there because I thought I would do more damage than good, but I just neglected it, and I got focused on this other buck, that I'm chasing in this pretty confined area. I went there post-season, and sure enough, I mean, it was like a light switch went off. That hillside that I went to look on, it took me about all but 3 minutes to find a major buck, like a true buck bedding area, a mature buck bedding area. He had multiple trees grinded down like the handle of a Louisville Slugger. So, it was kind of like, oh man, yeah, I mean, that's after the fact now, but I'll remember that going into next year, whether that buck that made that specific set of rubs, and that is his bed right there, whether he survived or not is regardless to the fact that another one could be there as well. So, it's something that, you don't always, in us as hunters, especially hunting free range whitetails, you never always figure it out. These animals are always one step ahead of you. So you got to, be looking at as much information as you can get to catch up to one of these boys. So.
All right, so we've covered a lot so far, but we haven't even really gotten into the detailed part of all this, which is the meat and potatoes of the specific types of features you can identify on maps and how to use those as you set stands and actually hunt. But before we get to all of that, we do need to pause for a very brief intermission of sorts to thank our sponsors of this episode, Trophy Ridge. And today, I wanted to briefly talk about one of the categories that Trophy Ridge participates in, which is arrow rests. And specifically, I wanted to very quickly discuss the pros and cons of the two main types of arrow rests available. Those being full containment rests and drop away rests. And if you're a relatively new bow hunter, this is something you really want to pay attention to. So I thought I'd give you a quick overview. So first, full containment rests. These rests are typically what I'd recommend for newer hunters because they are nearly foolproof. I say that because these rests, as evidenced by their name, fully hold the arrow inside, within that rest. It keeps you from ever having the chance of that arrow falling off or bouncing around off the rest, anything like that while you're actually in the tree. I've had that happen before in the past when I was using the old 2-prong rest, which was something I started out with when I was like 13 years old. So this today looks like something like the Trophy Ridge Whisker Biscuit, which is essentially a circle of bristles which hold your arrow in the middle and allow the veins to pass through, or there are like 3-prong rests, which hold an arrow in place from 3 different directions, holding in the middle. So that's a popular option, especially for beginners, but the downside of these is that there's significant contact between your arrow and the rest. And the longer your arrow is in contact with any part of your bow, the greater the chance is that you might move that bow in some way, which in turn impacts the arrow flight. So to avoid that, the drop away rest was created, which in short is a rest that upon release drops out of the path of the arrow. Now, these rests are widely believed to be a little bit more accurate than your full containment, but with many of these, you lose some of that arrow security that you would have with a full containment design. So with all that being said, when I first got a compound bow, I used a Trophy Ridge Whisker Biscuit, and it worked great for me. But eventually, I was becoming a little bit more advanced, and I wanted to try to squeeze a little bit more accuracy out of my bow, and I switched to a drop away. So now most recently, I've been using a Trophy Ridge HX drop away rest, which does in fact have some pretty solid containment measures in place as well. So I hope this was helpful. We've recently been getting a lot of emails and tweets and Facebook messages from people who've been inspired by the podcast to try bow hunting for the first time. So I thought I'd share this kind of beginner look at arrow rest, because that's a topic that I know I struggle with a lot when I first started bow hunting, trying to figure out what's the right way to go. So I hope this was a quick, helpful primer. If you want more information, there's lots of stuff online. I would definitely recommend you go Google arrow rest, and there'll be plenty to read. If you are specifically interested in learning more about Trophy Ridge, you can go to trophyridge.com. So, with all that out of the way, now let's get back to the show. So true. It's a never-ending process, and I think me and Dan always like to joke that I guess that's probably why we love it so much, is that it's just you can never put the whole puzzle together. You never solve the equation completely. It's there's always going to be something more. So given, I guess, kind of where we've gone so far, right? We've got the basics of our maps down. We've talked about all the different ways you can use maps. I think one of the aspects of using maps that a lot of people either struggle with or just want to learn more about is, okay, what are the specific things I'm looking for on a map? And then, what's that actually look like on the ground? So how do I find it on a map? How do I ground truth it? And then how do hunters and or deer, or I guess both, how do deer use them? And then how do hunters need to use them? So I'm going to kind of grill you here, Ben. You had mentioned a bunch of different types of features as we've been talking so far, and I've been keeping note of some of those. So I want to dig deeper into a bunch of these in detail, if that sounds good to you. So how about funnels at first? We've kind of talked about this a little bit, and we mentioned a lot in the podcast, but I think it's always worth revisiting some of these in detail. Can you kind of lay out for us, okay, what's a funnel? What are the different types of funnels? And that'd be interesting in hearing like detailed examples of what those different types of funnels might look like.
Sure. And man, this could be a conversation that could go on for a long time with how to hunt all these different types of funnels. But basically, the concept of a funnel, you might be reading in articles or see on television or whatnot. Sometimes they're called pinch points. Sometimes they're called bottlenecks. There's some different names for these things, but basically the goal is to find features that are going to force that deer are going to naturally be confined. Not I don't say confined, but basically areas are going to push deer through in tighter areas that you can that you can possibly get a shot at. So deer are looking for the most efficient way to get from A to B in the safest manner. That caveat is the safest. So it's not always the shortest distance. It's going to be the easiest way to get from one place to the next, but they feel safe. So you think about funnels, just like we talked about our map layers in two different ways. You've got your terrain funnels, so actual topographic features that are going to guide deer movement based on elevation change. So you got your benches, your saddles, ditches and draws, points on the end of a ridge, bluffs. All of these features are one way or another going to play into deer movement. And then you've got your land cover features, which are sometimes easier to see. So streams, roads, ponds, fence lines, gates. Gates isn't necessarily a piece of land cover, but you got these hardened areas that are going to have deer get from A to B in the safest manner. And the most blatant one to think about is a brushy fence line. So I hunt these a lot in Kansas. Every year we go there, and there's not big tracts of timber, but there's these smaller woodlots that are connected with brushy fence lines. And that fence line is going to have the most security in a straight path from one piece of timber to the next. And they can be really hot during the rut whenever bucks are seeking does. So you look for these areas that are you're going to be able to assume the deer are going to be forced into moving a certain way based on either the elevation change or the cover. So,
yeah, and I'd add one other to the cover related funnels is actually just cover. So not even necessarily a fence or a gate, but also just if there's thicker brush, even, if there's a thick brushy section that crosses a wide open field, or if there's a line of cedar trees, or a section where two square woodlots come together at a corner and there's just a corner that meets, even just brush or vegetation can create a funnel in that way if there's not, funnels in some other way, larger cover. So yeah, there's so many different types of funnels there you mentioned. When it comes to,
I want to take a step back real quick. One thing I didn't mention, Mark, was the concept of, before we get into all these different terrain features and cover features, we're going to talk about the concept of edge. Edge is really not even necessarily a whitetail's, but an animal's best friend. It's funny because Aldo Leopold actually wrote about this. As a famous quote says, "The variety and density of life is greatest along edge." So basically, you get these areas that are really attractive to wildlife, whether it's for travel or security or a variety of browse, or even just for a social opportunity. Anytime you can look at a map and see a change, which is basically the definition of edge, what I'm talking about is where terrain or cover changes over a landscape. So where a field meets timber, where heavy cover meets open pasture, where your food plot meets your CRP. Really, any change that you look for is really right off the bat. If I'm starting from scratch, I'm going to look at a property, and I'm going to look at the aerial, and it's going to identify where these changes of edge are. So it's pretty cool. I was doing some research about the concept of edge, and Native Americans actually used to burn areas in their timber, and then where it meets the prairie, and then deer in wildlife in general would go there where there was the succulent regrowth right on the edge of the timber and prairie. It was a hot spot for where they would hunt. So it's like, you got to think that's almost like the beginning of the history of food plots almost, which is really not exactly what they're trying to do. But, the concept of edge from a wildlife perspective is the most important part. So all of these terrain funnels and pinch points and cover features, it all has to do with edge and change. So
that's a great point. And one other edge that I just thought of as you're kind of running through those different examples, which kind of applies to a circumstance that I've dealt with in the past. One of the challenges I've had hunting up at my northern Michigan property, where I grew up learning to hunt, was that a big portion of these properties were just huge timber. It was just tons and tons and tons of timber. And I always kind of struggled to figure out, how the heck do you hunt this when there isn't like a definite food source? There isn't like a definite bedding area. And one of the things I realized is that even though there aren't these defined kind of features like there might be in ag land in lower Michigan or Iowa, even though those easy features weren't there still were edges, like you mentioned. And that's what I keyed in on is, okay, where are the edges? And it might not even be like a field to timber, but even an edge within timber. So what I ended up keying in on is I could find an edge between like conifers, like cedars, and where the cedar patches bumped up against an edge of open oak timber, all of a sudden I realized, hey, these are edges where all of a sudden deer are traveling, or the edge of a little bit of a swampier, wetter area with a higher ground, drier area. All of a sudden I started realizing, hey, there's where bucks are cruising too. So in a big timber situation, even finding those edges of unique types of timber or types of cover within that larger timber section can be helpful too. That's just a specific example I thought of that I found helpful. But going back, I guess, to the specifics, now that we understand, the importance of edge, which is huge. How about those terrain funnels? Can we talk about a few of those in detail? I want to talk about saddles. You already mentioned benches a little bit, but how are deer using saddles, and what does that look like? I know you used our knuckle example, but can you elaborate on saddles a little bit?
Yeah. So if you remember staring at your fist, the saddle is going to be that low spot in between your two knuckles, or the low spot in real life in between two hills, or a low spot along a ridge line. And a lot of times it seems like deer will go, they'll use those to get from one side of the hill to the next because it's the path of least resistance. A lot of times deer are, quite frankly, lazy creatures. So to get from one side of the hill, they want to go on the other side. They're going to use that lowest spot on the ridge line, which is going to be your saddle. So it's not always, it's not like I know I don't necessarily have any saddles on this property I'm hunting in Iowa, but back in Pennsylvania, the original property I grew up hunting, there's a dynamite saddle, and you can identify it from the topo map. It's pretty blatant, and it basically looks like an hourglass, if you're looking at those contour lines in between two hills. But it's a great stand location we've had for a really long time. We actually had to switch out stands multiple times from the tree growing into. I mean, it's one of those places where there will always be stand location, because especially during the rut, for a deer, a buck to cover more ground and potentially find that doe quicker or easier, that is just a natural, easy way for him to hop over to the other side. So the saddle is that's definitely a good one, especially for the rut.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and especially like in what it sounds like you had in Pennsylvania, again, sections of bigger timber where there's not as much of the cover funnels, like we talked about, but these terrain funnels like a saddle, like if you're trying to figure out a new piece of property, let's say, public land in Tennessee or West Virginia or something like that, where you have big timber and some rolling topography, some hills and stuff, it's hard at first to figure out how the heck do I approach this. But if you look at a map that shows these topographic contours, like you said, you can see that hourglass type of line shape there that indicates, yeah, here's a saddle, and right away, boom, that's a spot that could potentially funnel deer. And like you said, during the rut, it's a great time to be there. And the same thing goes for benches, like you talked about, right? Those are the gaps where there's the very close together lines, and then a little bit wider, and then tight again beneath it, where that's one other example of deer using the path of least resistance, where it's easier for them to walk that flatter bench along a hillside or a ridge when they're trying to get to point A or B. So these terrain funnels, I think, are huge, especially during the rut time frame, and when you're trying to figure out how to approach a property that maybe doesn't have these easier generic cover funnels that you see on the Outdoor Channel or whatever. These can be super helpful. Yeah,
for sure. So you got saddles and benches. That all kind of plays into to have a saddle, you need a ridge. So a ridge is probably the most common terrain term that we all talk about as hunters, and the ridge is essentially extending terrain that is at a higher elevation from its surrounding areas. You're going to have a ridge that extends out as a line, and at the end of that ridge, there's always going to be an end of the ridge, and it's going to start to slope down. That's going to be your point. So deer aren't necessarily moving right along the top of the ridge, like right along the crest of it. I mean, that's going to be where they're able to be, predators could silhouette them So it seems like a lot of times these whitetails are moving 30 yards or farther off of the edge of the very crest of the ridge on either side, and those trails meander along at a certain elevation or at an angle from the bottom, working their way up to the top and then towards the point of the ridge. Got another tree stand on the Pennsylvania property that has just been dynamite. It's not at the very it's at the end of the ridge, and it starts to slope down a little bit, and it's really good because whenever you hunt off of these ridges, you can be assured that you've got a pretty consistent wind. That's one thing that it's important. You want to know where your wind is going to be going and the possibility for a wind change, how that's going to affect the rest of your sit. So at the end of the point, you'll find sometimes multiple trails intersecting, and that can be really good a lot of different times throughout the year, based on if you're hunting in the morning or you're hunting in the afternoon, where the food source is, where the bedding is. But it's still bringing multiple possible trails together at an interesting terrain feature. So that point at the end of a ridge that's been a big one for me. And the fact that you can hunt it with a steady wind, it's always a no-brainer when I look at the topo map or the aerial. I'm going to find a ridge that looks solid, and I'm going to look at the point and probably get a stand there.
And so you're saying with the point, you have deer that hypothetically might be traveling on either side of the ridge potentially, and when they get to the point, though, the point is where those two sides coincide in the middle, right? That's where they come together. So that point gives you the fact you're working one line of travel, like deer are likely to travel along the edge of that ridge, and then, heck, this is where the two ridges come together. You double your odds, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're always looking, we're ground truth and looking for where, one trail is nice, where two trails meet is even nicer, and then when three trails meet, that's the real deal. So, a lot of times you can find that at the point, and it seems like I've had multiple encounters with a couple bandy bucks that are skirting basically one side of the ridge, and they come right around the point, maybe a third of the way down, and then they're working their way around. They're basically just scent checking as much as they can off of that ridge. So eventually, if he gets the whole way around you, unless your wind is blowing straight up the ridgeline or straight off the ridgeline, that could be a detriment or good if it blows over the trail. But it just seems like it's a hot spot for deer whenever they're cruising and working their way from bed to feed, or even during the rut when bucks are looking for does.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about the wind when it comes to sets like that. I've always found, like as you mentioned, most of the travel seems to be, at least what I've seen, usually it seems to be one of two places. You're either going to see a lot of the travel, like you said, like about a third of the way down the ridge, sort of near the top, along its edges, or you'll see some right in the bottom sometimes when there's larger valleys and things, or that might be where they're coming from another side and dropped on the bottom. But the challenge with those bottom locations, at least from what I've seen, what a lot of guys I've talked to, is right when you get down low, your wind is not steady. You're going to get swirling winds, and you're going to get things messed up with the wind. But if you stay up higher and take advantage of that top third, that's where, as you mentioned a second ago, that's where you can get steadier wind. So you're safer from a wind perspective and still taking advantage of a common travel pattern, which is why I think, at least for me, as I'm hunting more in these areas with a lot of changing terrain, a ridgeline is an automatic go-to area, again, whether it be a saddle or just a ridge without saddles. But again, that's something that consistently seems to attract a consistent pattern of deer movement, which you can take advantage of.
Yeah, for sure. And it's easy to get sucked into the when you're scouting, especially on the bottoms where you can see a lot of good deer sign. I've seen where people write about bucks prefer those lower areas in a draw where it's maybe flat, and they're just totally secluded from the pressure of hunting or the pressure of other deer or doe families. They kind of got their own spot there, at least mature bucks, and it's tempting. You can go down there and see a bunch of scrapes, a bunch of rubs, but if you don't have a consistent wind, it's only a matter of time until you get picked off, and you damage your hunting season pretty fast. So, yeah, the ridges and and what's on the ridges and what's at the end of ridges are exciting. And then that kind of transitions right into, what is a draw and how does that play off of a ridge, and from a terrain perspective, and that can be pretty exciting for a deer hunter. So
yeah, I two things, I guess. I want to take one quick tiny step back and just mention here the one other thing with ridges that I've seen that I think is worth taking note of again, and tell me if you've seen this too, is that lots of times in places with ridge lines, that with that kind of terrain, you're going to see a lot of deer bedding on ridges or little knobs off of ridges. Those seem to attract and be quality bedding areas for deer, especially buck beds. I found some of the best buck beds I've found have been in those types of situations where you see a little knob or something coming off of a consistent ridge with a little patch of cover on it maybe, and you'll find that buck, at least from what I've heard and seen, lots of these bucks will bed with their back to the ridge, looking down over that draw or that valley, and then they can watch ahead of them and they can smell behind them, and it's kind of a great situation for a buck or any deer to bed. So that's something I always key in on when I'm looking at a map. I try to identify those ridges, and then okay, that might be a funnel, but then also where might the bedding areas be along that ridge, and then that's going to help inform how I hunt, especially during the rut too.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny you mentioned the buck bedding areas. There's a phenomenal article that was just written by a guy you've had on multiple times on the show, Jeff Sturgis. He just put together this article 2 days ago that talks about different buck bedding areas, and that's one scenario that he kind of lays out 3 different environments for a whitetail hunter, from swampland to flat agricultural land to really hilly country. And what you just mentioned there is definitely one of the prime spots to for a buck to bed. Is kind of higher up on that ridge, overlooking the bottom with his wind at his back. And then what's interesting when it comes to this hill country and your ridges and the benches, you're hunting off of benches on the side of these ridges, you got your thermals that come into play. So just I guess a quick breakdown. The thermals is essentially wind currents that rise and fall throughout the day from the atmosphere heating up or cooling down. So if a buck is bedded in the morning on higher ground, he's able to smell everything that's below him. He's probably going to be able to see a decent amount, but if he's in thick cover, he'll at least be able to smell everything that's below him, because as the sun peaks up over the horizon and starts to heat up the air, those wind currents are going to just come from the bottom, and they're going to rise up, and it's literally going to be like a wind. I'll never forget this. This past fall, it was like the picture perfect day. It was actually Halloween morning, I believe. I was sitting there in a famous stand that my dad and I call Skyscraper, and it's right off the side of a ridge, and there's no wind, but I'm sitting in a beech tree, an old one, great tree to put a tree stand in. But regardless, I'm looking at these branches that extend out, and they hold their leaves longer throughout the year than a lot of other trees. And the whole limb is just rising, and then 10 seconds later it'll drop, and then it'll rise for a little while, and then it'll drop. And I'm thinking, man, that's crazy. And it struck me. I mean, that's a thermal I'm seeing right there. So that air is literally coming from the bottom, rising the whole way up the side of that hill. And this must have been a pretty aggressive one. It was like a really cold morning until the sun came up. So it's interesting to see that. And then as the sun sets, you're literally going to get the reverse of what happens. So that sun sets, that air is cooled, and it's going to drop back down into those cooler areas. So just another thing to think about whenever, it comes to your scent and your wind, and how all of that's playing into the terrain. And, it's all just one big crazy picture, for a whitetail hunter.
Yeah. Great point. Especially when you're hunting in areas that have this type of changing terrain with ridges and stuff. That's where these things really, really make a big difference. So huge point. And I guess just I can't remember if we mentioned at the beginning of this, the ridge little piece or not, but when you're looking at a map, right, you can't necessarily see a ridge really well on just a plain aerial map, but if you have one that shows terrain relief or that has topographic lines, you'll be able to see, correct me if I'm wrong, but right, we're going to see consistent parallel lines that are at least tighter together than they are at the top or bottom, right? And then the
Yep.
point would obviously be where two of those come together to form what looks like, like you mentioned, a finger coming off of your knuckles, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, you've nailed it. Just parallel lines going along the same route.
Perfect. So you mentioned draws. Talk to me about draws. What's that going to look like on a map? And then how about in the field? What's it look like? How are deer using those?
Okay. Yeah. So if you're looking at a traditional topo map, a draw is going to look. How do I describe this? It's basically, I almost look at it as like the beak of a bird cutting into or pointing towards a ridge. And really what that means is what's happening on the ground is that water runoff is going through time, erode. It's going to find that lowest area and it's going to continue to erode, and basically make small valleys that come right off of that ridge and cut down over the hill. And they can get pretty drastic. They can get pretty deep. So the draw is really that whole, let's say you're at the very bottom and you're at a creek bottom and you're looking uphill and you see this cut it's really definitive, and it's like somebody almost took a knife and cut right through the middle of the hillside, right up towards the ridge. That's going to be your draw. And that draw is, it can be gradual or it can be steep. But one thing you'll find consistently is at the very top, right at the head of that draw, is going to be probably some pretty good deer sign. As that water is running off the side of the hill, it's created this ravine. It gets deeper and deeper and more aggressive. And those deer, if they're in a rush or they're escaping, they're going to jump right over it potentially. But as they're just, having their normal pattern, they're not just going to cross over something really steep. They're going to work their way kind of up the hill, up towards the top, where they can get around the head of that draw. So it's a dynamite stand location. Another good one for wind. You can have it depending on a lot of times you'll see this where the draw will come up and meet the very top is a field up on top. They kind of go hand in hand with ditches, which we can get into, but it all has to do with water runoff, and there's small valleys that go down over the hill, and deer will use the sides of them and work their way up and down, and then they'll cross at the very top, or maybe somewhere where at the bottom of the draw, or it gets a little more gradual at the bottom too. So it's kind of like that hardened place where it's tougher to get from one side to the next. They'd rather just, instead of making the jump, go and work their way up the top and work around.
And it's kind of, you can almost use this in conjunction with ridges. It's like a funnel within a funnel of sorts. Let's say hypothetically during the rut, you're going to have a lot of bucks cruising that ridge. So we've already said, okay, lots of times the ridge line will funnel deer along the top third because of all these reasons. Well, then in addition to that, if there's one of these draws that comes up the ridge that's going to force deer to move along that ridge up at the very top of it, now all of a sudden, okay, it's likely deer are going to be on this ridge. And now it's even more likely that if they're on their ridge, they're going to have to go through this even narrower section. So I think that's a perfect example of how you can look at a map before even ever being on a property and see, okay, here's a ridge, here's the draw on the ridge. I'm betting this point right here is an exceptional spot to start my scouting and to potentially hunt during certain parts of the year, right?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
And like you mentioned, that's essentially the same with ditches, kind of the same thing, right? We're talking about water coming off the top and creating a cut.
Yeah. So the ditches is really going to be a similar concept, but instead of a big hardwood ridge with draws and spurs coming off of the side, let's take a relatively flat piece of agriculture that's being farmed. Well, that water is going to run off one way or another off of that field, and it's going to find that lowest elevation and run and erode. You're going to find ditches. So sometimes you can find these things without a topo map. You just look at an aerial, and if you can see all these fingers of timber jutting into the field, that's probably where you're going to find a ditch, because it's going to be where water has naturally run off. They can't farm there because it's too steep of a slope, or they're not going to farm where there's going to be a bunch of water. So by nature, that area grows up with brush and timber, and water is going to come right off that field and cut right down into that finger of timber. So the ditch is really the same concept. These deer aren't just going to run back and forth throughout the whole. They're not going to run perpendicular to the ditch the whole way down. There might be a select crossing or two, but they're really going to scoot around the property at the head of that ditch. And a lot of times you can find it goes right back into what we're talking about with edge. So you got not only this terrain funnel where it's just easier to get around that finger of timber and head to the next part of the field, but you got edge as well. So you got that sense of security for a deer that's scooting along. So there's efficiency there. There's security. It's a lot of good things can happen with these ditches. So sometimes you can find, and this would transition right into the next terrain feature we could talk about, is the creek crossings. The ditch is really going to define where deer are going to travel the majority of time. And you can almost go and ground truth these ditches and find crossings occasionally throughout where maybe it's a little gradual, where the bank may not be as eroded away as another part. So a quick story though, real quick, about draws before we totally get off of them.
Yeah.
This past fall, the pork buck. So I ran into him in October, and I encountered this deer a bunch. I had an idea that he was living off of this one spur, I'll call it, which is basically like a secondary ridge. You got the main top, and then you got all these ridges extending off from the top, and in between those spurs or secondary ridges are the draws. Well, I had an idea. He's on this one ridge. He's bedding there, and I set up on the next spur over, and we're separated by a draw. And I literally within about a half hour of daybreak, sure enough, I could see him with a doe, but not totally with her. He was checking her out, but he wasn't actually tending her. So I grunted at him, and I mean, we're talking November 8th or 9th. I mean, he is in, total dominance mode. I grunted at him, and he just came. He threw his head up, looked right over at me, and he just made a beeline straight for me, not using the head of the draw that we're talking about. I mean, he went right down over the hillside like it was a cliffhanger, and by the time he disappeared, I grabbed my bow, and I'm swinging around. I could already see his tines coming back up. So afterwards, after the postseason, I went and scouted that area. Man, I can't believe he went through there. And he was able to jump over the ravine of the draw. But it just goes to show, I mean, when these deer want to get from one place to the next, they're fully capable of doing that in the fastest way possible. So it's not always a guarantee with what we're talking about here, but it's kind of an interesting thing. So
yeah. So I'm wondering though, what happened? He turned around with a bow. His tines showed up. What happened?
Yeah. So the way I was hunting, it was kind of a good wind, but it was where he came. He caught my wind. It was a setup that would have worked for a lot of scenarios other than this one, and he basically, I mean, I was at full draw, and he needed about 3 more steps to hit my lane, and he slammed on the brakes, and he knew something wasn't right. So,
oh, man.
I a lot of times early season, I'm hunting those winds where I'm fully confident I'm not going to get busted, but come game time during the rut, you're sitting full days. Obviously you can make adjustments in the morning or evening, but, sometimes I'll get a little more aggressive, with these deer and with these winds, and try to hunt a buck on a wind that's almost perfect for him, but not completely, and almost completely horrible for me, but not. So,
yeah.
Almost totally in his favor, but a little bit in my favor as well. Just so happened he busted me on this circumstance, but I ended up seeing him 3 or 4 more times after that, and I didn't spook him off of the whole north face of where I was hunting him, but it's just, interesting to see how these terrain features can drive these deer, and other times, man, they just go where they want to go.
Yeah, that's the truth. I think what you said was a really good point, was that these things aren't rules. They're not. These are simply patterns of
Yeah.
sometimes consistent use, but they're still wild animals and they can do crazy things sometimes.
For sure.
So
that's it.
Yeah. So you mentioned creek crossings. What? I guess my first question about creek crossings is, can you see creek crossings or where certain features of a creek will funnel deer from a map, or is that something you have to ground truth?
No, you can definitely see it from the map. I learned this from Bill Winke. He's put this out in multiple publications. I actually talked to him in person about this, and it's like, when it comes to no-brainer, guaranteed features that deer are going to use, it's creek crossings. You can see this with a topo map, and you can see it with an aerial. You can see it with both, and whenever the topo is combined with the aerial, it just jumps out at you, completely. But as the stream is winding, as the stream is going along its own path, and it makes these turns and twists and these S curves, let's just call them S curves. Every time that stream makes a drastic curve, you got to think that water is, just by the forces and laws of physics, continually washing away that side where it makes that turn. So it's going to be flowing down with momentum, as it turns, it's going to hit that bank, and it's going to cut the side of that bank. And then it's going to work its way down again, down the rest of the stream. But where you see those big curves is where you're going to see your most drastic edges of the creek bank. And then in between those curves, where the stream gets straight again, you're going to find your shallowest, most gradual stream bed edges, which means that those deer are going to be crossing there. So the more you have, and this is all from Bill. I'm translating this from Mr. Winke here, but it's pretty slick. If you look at a map, it's got a stream in it, and it's got a bunch of S curves. That's just going to enhance and dramatize more creek crossings. So you go and you find maybe a couple places where there's a nice S curve, and you're in between two curves, and you find a straightaway. Go ground truth that area, and you're probably going to see a creek bank that is more gradual and probably a pretty good deer trail there. Now, on the other hand, if you've got a stream that's just going straight as an arrow, working its way through the timber or a field or whatnot, it's not going to be as drastic of a concentration of creek crossings, because those deer can, hop along that bank. Probably is not changing its face much at all. So, it kind of depends on the lay of the land, but like in pasture, a lot of pasture ground in the Midwest, these streams just seem to wind and make every twist and turn, and they can really show you some great places to potentially set up as a creek crossing, where a deer is just getting from one place to the next. He's going to funnel right through there, and you're going to get a crack out.
Yeah. And I guess to all of these different types of features, right? We've talked about all these different land features that in some way will influence deer to travel through a certain area. And so they're all in some way or another are kind of like funnels, because they're influencing deer in some way. We've talked a lot about how these can be hunted during the rut, right? Because that's just a kind of usual way of hunting the rut, is get into a funnel where deer are going to travel through a lot and you're going to have a good chance. But I think it's worth noting for all these things, especially something like a creek crossing, funnels can be hunted, or all these features can be hunted effectively at other times of the year too. It's just that you want to be between the two main goals of a deer's life, which is bedding and feeding. So if you can find a creek crossing between where they want to eat and where they're bedded, well, now you've got the funnel between bedding and feeding, which is their most likely route of travel. So I think that can be applied early season. It can be applied late season. It can be applied during the rut. It just depends on where does this feature lie between, and then that's what's going to determine whether you hunt it at October 1st or November 1st. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The goal is to have some sense of understanding of where the deer are bedding and then where they're feeding, and how can you get in between or at their destination one way or another, whether it's afternoon or morning, how you can get there before they do. And if if you don't end up seeing the deer that you want, how do you get out of there without spooking them and blowing them out? So entry and exit is just as important here as where we're hunting. In fact, a lot of people say, and I think this is a fact, that it's more important than where you're hunting. Making sure that you're getting in and you're getting out undetected so that you're not educating the deer herd, because you could have all of these amazing pinch points and funnels and all these great terrain features that you can hunt and you're excited about. But if you're educating the deer that are living there that would be using those funnels if they didn't know you were there, then, you're wasting your time. So getting in, getting out is huge. And these features play their own roles throughout all of hunting season, whether it's September, early season, all the way into January, late season.
Yeah, so true. And it's one of those things we talk about a ton, right? Almost every podcast or every other podcast, we mention access and entry and exit so many times. But it's one of those things that, and I'm guilty of this as anyone, is that it's easier said than done in a lot of cases. I mean, there's so many times where I know I need to enter or exit a certain way, but I'm rushed on time, or I don't want to go through the briars this time, or whatever it is. And it's easy to get lazy with it, but I think that's why it's important that we always mention it, because I need to remind myself sometimes that, hey, you have to sometimes go the extra mile or whatever it is, because if you don't, it might make it a little more convenient for you, but you just blew your hunt. So yeah,
for sure. I mean, the access is always, I mean, it is easy to kind of get in that. I've been guilty of getting in the same thing where, you kind of have an idea of, okay, the deer are bedding there, they're feeding here, I've got to leave this way. But if you continue to pound that area in and out, eventually they're going to figure they're going to catch your trail. So, it's a constant battle to kind of be one step ahead of them, which is, it's hard to do. I remember talking to Jeff Sturgis one time, and he mentioned that especially on public ground, he would go in and he would literally have a different, even if he's hunting the same stand, he's got 4 consistent wins, 4 mornings in a row, he's going to access that stand 4 different ways to, number 1, prevent from educating the deer, but number 2, to prevent from educating hunters. So guys that are sharing property, if you can scatter yourself, how you're entering and exiting at the stand location, it's going to be good for you.
That's a great point. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And I think the whole point of our conversation is you can make some of these decisions on how you enter and exit, again, by looking at these things on a map, thinking about it on almost a macro perspective to a degree, thinking about, okay, how does my property fit into the larger scheme of things? How do I need to get in and out to make sure I'm not spooking these deer that maybe aren't on my property but could be influenced by my movements and all that. So it's something that can't be understated. Now, we've covered all sorts of different types of funnels, benches and saddles and ditches and ridges and points and creek crossings and how all these different things can look like, how they look on a map, how to identify them on the ground, how deer use them. There's one other one that came to mind for me that I was reminded of by something you posted on Facebook. You posted a map, an image of essentially a low spot in a field, a swale. You posted a picture of a swale and how deer use that. Can you talk about that a little bit? How you can see that on a map, why that's important?
Yeah, absolutely. That post received some pretty awesome feedback, and it looks pretty basic on the map. But basically, all you're looking for is a low spot in the field. I just always called them field creases, but they're also known as swales, or I think some people call them field saddles, and that's really what it is. It's a low spot in between 2 higher places in the field, and a lot of times that in that crease it'll connect at the side of each. At each side of that low spot will be a finger of timber that probably has a ditch or a draw coming from it that is pointing towards another low spot, which is going to be the head of the opposite ditch or finger or draw. And bucks, I've seen them multiple times come right out to the field, and it's like, if you're in a tree stand, you're like, man, that thing has a lot of confidence just scooting right through the middle of that field in the middle of the day. But the fact is, he's preventing himself from being silhouetted. And a lot of times he'll be coming out from one, he's worked one area of timber, scent checking for deer, or scent checking for does, and then he'll use that swale, that low spot, to scoot through and just hop right over the other side of that field and check the edge and dive into the timber on the other side. So you got two dynamite spots, probably for different wind directions, that you can hunt right there. It's a great spot, not necessarily just for the rut. I mean, all of these features can be hot for the rut for the most part, but if deer feel safe and it's easy, they're probably going to use that, and that's a good one for sure.
I don't know what you've seen, but I have seen this type of feature be particularly deadly in the case where that field is relatively narrow. So like in a lot of places where you have these fields that run along the top of high ground, right? Like we mentioned, you'll have the ditches or the ridge or the draws down low, and that's all timber. So like, for example, in Iowa, where I was hunting in Iowa this year, all the fields are up high, all the timber's down low in these cuts and the valleys and stuff. But because of that, it makes these like fingers, almost like a hand. You've got a hand stretched out, and each one of the fingers extending out is a finger of that field. So in those circumstances where the field is like a narrow finger extending out, those are the spots that I've just found that, man, when you find the low spot in that field, there's a ton of travel across through there.
Oh yeah,
that's just a really good spot. If you're going to hunt a field edge for whatever reason, definitely I think that's where you're going to see a lot of the entry and exit of the field come into play.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've even had situations like turkey hunting when we're moving from one spot to the next, and you can't. It's not always evident until you're walking along that field where a lot of agricultural fields will have a roll to them, and just it doesn't take much, even if you're 6'5", to which I'm not, but regardless, it doesn't take much to hide, whenever you're in one of these things. So I can remember last year, turkey hunting here in Iowa and moving from one spot to the next. And sure enough, I mean, it doesn't look like there's anything out there. Right in one of these swales, there's two big longbirds, and they saw us coming, a mile away, but I didn't see them. So it's not only deer that are using these low spots to their advantage. It's all wildlife. But these are the things you got to look for, and it always goes back to looking at the map and then ground truthing it. But yeah, for sure, that specific feature is a deadly one, and one that's not always talked about.
And when you're looking for that on a map, let's say if you have a map that shows topographic lines, is it just going to look like a saddle, but just like a much less exaggerated saddle, or different?
Yeah, it's gonna look like a saddle in the middle of the field. But even if you don't have topo map, if you see the edge of timber kind of peek out to the edge of the field, and then literally if you draw a straight line from that to the next side, to the opposite side of the field, if you have timber poking out into the side there, guaranteed that's a low spot in the field. You got to check that out. So you don't always need topo map to see that. It definitely helps though, and that's essentially what it is. It's a saddle. You're going to see your lines coming closer together as it goes downhill, and then when it hits the bottom of that swale or that crease, it's going to be flat for a minute, and then it's going to the opposite side is going to have your lines tighter together again. So, it's a good one.
Nice. Yeah. Like you said, it's often overlooked, but can be a really great place to focus some time. And I think a lot, we kind of alluded to it as we've gone along, but it's all about, when you're trying to pick a spot to hang a tree stand, it can be difficult if you're just saying, okay, where's the bedding area, or here's a food plot, I'm going to hunt on the edge of the food plot, or I think deer bed in this chunk of timber, I'm just going to set up a tree stand randomly somewhere around here. I think a lot of us start deer hunting like that, and then you slowly realize that you need to look for the thing within the thing. So, okay, I know I want to be near this bedding area, but where's the best place to be along this ridge that approaches the bedding area? Well, that's where these types of features come into play when you start realizing, okay, I know that there's a bedding area here, so I need to be on the ridge near this bedding area. Oh, by the way, there's this draw that comes up the ridge. Now I want to be there. Or I see that there's a swale in the field above me that's probably going to pull a lot of the traffic coming up this ridge to probably want to cross here. So it's putting all these pieces together to start like identifying the hot spots, those places where travel intersects and where you're going to have that greatest chance to be within bow range if you're a bow hunter, or gun range too. So it's a big old puzzle. I feel like looking at the map really helps you bring the pieces together.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, you always get the best sense of direction when you're looking at a map that's blatantly telling you which way is north, south, east, and west. And it's easy to grab, this happened to me in Kansas 2 years ago. Go in, and I saw this dandy buck, middle of the day. I'll never forget this, freezing cold. Actually, Iowa got pounded with snow. It was like the second week of November. I was in Kansas. It was equally as frigid. Saw a really nice buck come scooting through about 12:30 in the afternoon. It totally justified, the painful whole day sit. But anyways, I saw him, grunted at him. He didn't want to have much to do with me, and I just kind of watched him for the rest of the time. And he worked his way down and ended up making a scrape in this small woodlot. And I knew the next day I was going to have another north. The wind was going to go from northwest to straight north, and I went back and looked at the map and realized, man, this is going to be an aggressive setup, but as long as the wind stays true north, my scent is going to be basically blowing straight down towards where he's coming from, but he's going to be a little bit farther east because of the fence line in the pasture. So if you come out hugging the edge of that fence line from the pasture, then I was going to be okay, and I set up for that. And the only way I was able to, looking at the map, going in there, you get into the woodlot, you get an idea of what the sense of direction is. But anyways, went in there, hung the stand, got out of there, and then the next morning, it was like the perfect script reading that's ever happened in my hunting career. He came right up that fence line, dropped down in, and I shot him at 7 yards before he could catch my wind. So you want to look for those situations where if you got an idea buck's coming from a certain area and he thinks he's got a great wind to be safe, or an almost great wind to be safe, and you've got a wind that's almost horrible for you, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And you can have some luck there. You don't always want to look for the situation that you have 100% awesome wind for you. You're never going to get busted. Because sometimes those deer, it's good for you and it's not necessarily good for them when they're trying to stay alive. So,
yeah.
It's just a lot of different things you can do when you look at the map. It can tell you a lot. And, sense of direction is obviously a really important one whenever you get the wind report every morning.
Yeah, so true. So, man, we've covered a lot here. We're coming up on time here, but is there any other major topic related to, using maps to better hunt deer? Is there anything we've missed, Ben? Or do you feel we covered as best as we could in this time?
Man, I think we covered a lot. We covered a lot of ground, and I want to caveat all this, everything we talked about, by saying that I am by no means a mega expert in the field of whitetail strategy and hunting and habitat management. I've just got a certain knowledge that I've acquired over the years with Huntera. And just by being a sponge with literally around every hunter that I'm around, I try to soak in as much information as possible. So a lot of these tactics I've confirmed over the years from, sightings that I've seen and encounters that I've had. But a lot of it also is just by default from clients that I've worked with over the years, or partners that I have that, we start talking shop on, hey, what's going on in your property? This looks like a good area. Is it? And bouncing ideas off of them, and that's where I was able to get a decent grasp on what to look for out of a map. But I'm by no means the encyclopedia of deer hunting expertise with maps or anything like that. But no, man, I appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, definitely. This has been great, and I think your level of expertise is just right there up there with all the other experts, or quote unquote experts, of deer hunting, because we're on the same boat, right? We're just learning from other people, taking whatever advice we can, trying to apply it in the field and seeing what works. So I
Absolutely.
think you've done a great job of cataloging a lot of those lessons learned, and it's been super helpful here for all of us, because I think this is one of those topics that you hear these buzzwords a lot. We talk about them a little bit, but we don't necessarily dive deep. So I think that this will be very helpful for everyone listening, and I hope it has been. So Ben, we haven't really got to go into detail about Huntera yet, but can you just, for those who aren't familiar, can you share a little bit more detail about what exactly your company is making? What kind of maps you're making, what's different about them, why they're kind of interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. So we specialize in custom land maps for hunters, habitat specialists, ranchers, land real estate agents, really anybody that needs the best view possible of their land is who we work for. Essentially, the foundation of Huntera is the blending of imagery or aerial photography and terrain shadowing or relief, so that you can see the rises and falls of your property and all the terrain features that we talked about, in addition to the actual picture and the land cover of your property with the aerial. And on top of that, we add layers like your property border or topo lines, which is, when we came out with that feature last year, it was pretty it was really well received. What we create, what we think is the ultimate map for hunters, and we can map anything from whether you got 40 acres all the way up to 4,000 acres and everywhere in between. We make maps on two different types of paper. We do field maps for taking out to the field, and it's going to be durable for you throughout the whole hunting season and the off season. And then we make poster maps, which are for interior display. Got a number of different sizes, but our the foundation of our company is really built around working one-on-one with each one of our customers. We get guys up all the time. They call us up all the time and say, "Hey, I've got this scenario. What do you think size-wise? I've got this much ground. What do you think I should get?" So we work one-on-one the whole way through the review process, and then once you're happy with the way the map is designed, that we do the review process through email. Once you're happy with that and give us the approval, that's when we'd actually send to the print shop. So we've got a lot of cool products, and our goal is just to make the ultimate map for the outdoorsman.
Well, from my experience, at least from what I've seen, you're definitely living up to that goal. I have been very impressed with his maps, and as I've alluded to throughout our conversation, have been using them over the past couple of years, and really they do help make all these different features and funnels and whatever. It really helps them pop. It helps you see these things in clear daylight, and then allows you to make smart deer hunting or management habitat improvement decisions. So it's a great tool, and I appreciate you sharing your incredible amount of experience and insight, and these stories and examples. I think have, at least for me even, have shed light a lot on these things. So Ben, thank you so much for your time.
Man, thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate it, and certainly appreciate the platform to share what we do with everybody that's listening from the Wired to Hunt Nation. So thanks a lot.
Hey, absolutely. And it's Huntera.com, right? If people want to learn more about what you're doing, Huntera.com.
Yeah, Huntera.com, and we're pretty active on. We've got a Facebook page and Instagram page, and those are the ways you can reach out and learn more about what we do.
Perfect. Well, I will make sure to include links to that in the blog post. And until next time, Ben, have a terrific evening.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, bye-bye. So there you go, another episode in the books, and I hope you all found this deep dive into mapping as helpful as I did. I like I said numerous times throughout the episode today, I just love this topic of maps and how you can use these tools, and I think Ben did a great job of breaking things down to the basics and then going into some of these more detailed concepts too. I had a blast with it, so hopefully I'm not the only one. Now, before we shut things down, I do have a couple quick requests, if you don't mind. So first, if you haven't done so yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could leave us a rating or review on iTunes. It is a huge help to us, so thank you in advance for doing that. It means the world. And while you're on iTunes, if you haven't subscribed yet to the podcast, make sure you do so. That allows you to get all the new episodes delivered automatically right to your phone or tablet or computer. Makes things super easy. So make sure to subscribe. And speaking of subscribing to podcasts, if you're not subscribed yet to the Whitetail Q&A podcast, that's another one you should definitely check out. That is my other podcast, the short form, quick podcast in which we answer one listener submitted question. That is a podcast I would love for you guys all to go listen to subscribe to. And if you haven't yet either, leave a review there as well. That is awesome. So thank you in advance. You can do that. And finally, we do need to thank our partners who help keep this podcast on the air. So thank you to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Ontario Maps, Ozonics, Lacrosse Boots, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. And finally, thank you all for being the best damn podcast audience on the planet. I really, truly appreciate you tuning in. So until next time, have a great day, chase those whitetail dreams, and stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.